few words of welcome from me. I'm Andreas Graf. I'm a senior associate for EU energy policy at Agora Energiewende and was one of the project leads for this project that has resulted in this study that we will be presenting today, at least a deep dive on industry and refineries. So a few words on the study itself, and let me begin with actually who we are. Agora Energiewende is a think and policy lab that has roughly 100 energy transition experts. We are based in offices in Berlin, Brussels, Beijing, and Bangkok, and have programs in roughly 20 countries if you count the activities we have, for example, in Southeast Asia and East Asia in the broader geographic context. We are an independent and non-partisan think tank with diverse financing structure, and we are driven by our vision, which is that of delivering a prosperous and carbon neutral global economy by 2050. And in doing so, we provide scientific-based solutions and policy advice to deliver clean power, heat, and industry in Germany, Europe, and around the globe. So we are here to provide answers to very difficult questions. And the one we looked at in this study that we will be looking at today in some greater detail was how can Europe become fossil gas free by 2050 against the backdrop of the commitment of the EU to become climate neutral by 2050. So this was a challenge that was particularly important to address against the backdrop also of the war in the Ukraine and the energy crisis that has triggered over the last year. So we modeled the main gas-consuming sectors, power and energy sector, buildings and industry, as well as the broader energy supply for the economy, and developed a decarbonization pathway until 2050 that would allow us to phase out fossil gas completely in Europe, and with an intermediate step and goal of phasing out Russian gas entirely by 2027. The focus of this study was on long-lasting demand reduction, so structural reductions of fossil gas demand, as opposed to short-term behavioral changes, people turning down their thermostats, for example, or industries for an intermediate period switching energy sources to overcome the energy crisis. So the focus was really on these long-term structural demand reductions. And another focus was on finding a cost-optimized balance between direct electrification and applications of hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives. The focus of the study was really on identifying what are the no-regret applications of hydrogen against the broader background of needing to achieve decarbonization of the entire energy sector. To perform this modeling, we worked with 3 different organizations. Artelis was leading the power sector and energy supply modeling, and their modeling was informed by detailed modeling of the individual sectors of buildings, on the one hand by TEP Energy, and industry and refineries by Wuppertal Institute. And today, of course, our focus is on this aspect of our modeling, on the industry and refinery sectors and the work that Wuppertal Institute has done. We also worked with national partners in 9 different countries, largely in Southeast Europe, that were particularly exposed to Russian gas dependence. And in the context of the energy crisis, we wanted to show how this pathway could look that would reduce that dependence while still achieving these climate goals. There are 4 key messages that coming from the study, and before handing over to Clemens, I did want to highlight those findings. So the first overall finding of our EU27 study is that fossil gas in Europe can be halved by 2030 and completely phased out by 2050. So this goal that we had set for ourselves to achieve in the modeling has, we show how it can be done. It is possible. And it is possible also while maintaining today's level of industrial production, so without, quote unquote, deindustrializing Europe, and while fully ensuring security of supply. So it is a feasible and realistic pathway that we have modeled. Secondly, by 2040, this pathway would achieve very significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 89% relative to 1990 levels, which is in particular important against the backdrop of the EU's forthcoming debate over setting a new 2040 climate target. The European Commission will propose or will submit to public discussion a communication with detailed modeling and analysis on a 2040 climate target and a greenhouse gas emissions budget for 2030 to 2050 in early next year, ahead of the European Parliament elections. We believe that our pathway shows that the EU can really aim for ambitious emissions reductions in that debate. Thirdly, we in our cost optimization of electrification versus hydrogen economy pathways have found that yes, Europe will need very significant amounts of renewable hydrogen to deliver on this goal of climate neutrality, and that is shown in our pathway. And Clemens Schneider from Wuppertal Institute today will highlight where hydrogen is also used, for example, in industry in this pathway. On the other hand, we do find that a cost optimal balance between electrification and hydrogen, or molecules, one could say, would have significantly less hydrogen deployed by 2030. So there would be a greater focus on direct electrification in the initial period, also to help ramp up the hydrogen supply chain to deliver those molecules to no regret sectors. And finally, what we identify several policy consequences from this analysis, especially with regards to current ongoing debates on gas and hydrogen infrastructure planning, as well as current decisions with regards to regulating space heating equipment and making decisions around minimum energy performance standards for buildings. And in this context, I also want to highlight that this is one of 4 webinars in our webinar series to present the findings of this report. We had an initial study launch webinar on the 4th of May. We had a deep dive on 24th of May for power sector and energy supply. And on Thursday, we will have a final webinar as well on buildings and district heating. So if you are interested in attending the webinar on Thursday, I can only encourage you to attend, and you can find the recordings of the previous webinars on our website. And finally, I just want to draw your attention to some recent publications that we have done, in part also with Wuppertal Institute, that also address some of the very important questions laid out in this study in greater detail, especially a study that was released just this week on a global steel transformation that I can only encourage you to read. And with that, I would like to hand over to Clemens Schneider and Georg Holz, and I would just maybe ask Georg Holz also to turn on his camera for a second to show himself. He will be joining us after Clemens's presentation, also to field some of your questions. But with that, please allow me to hand over to Clemens Schneider to introduce himself, as well as the detailed work he has done in the context of the study. Thank you.
Many thanks, Andreas, for the warm welcome and for the opportunity today to present our deep dive on industry. So I'm Clemens Schneider, senior researcher at the Wuppertal Institute, and together with Georg Holz, my colleague and senior researcher at our institute as well, we were in charge to model the industry of Europe, EU 27, plus a few other countries in and together in the consortium Andreas already mentioned with TEP Energy and Artelis in France. Yeah, let me start with some key assumptions of our storyline in the industry sector. Some of them were already Andreas already mentioned, I think, to some extent. But just to bring you into this storyline of our scenario. So Andreas already said we had not, the aim was of course not to show a deindustrialized Europe at the end of our scenario. So we have only slight relocations of production. So that's for the industry sector, of course, always the most important thing to start with. How is economic activity and how will production chains develop over time? So we assumed that the value chains and industrial structures within the EU are quite stable. We have some relocations within the EU. We'll come to that a bit later on. And we have also some exemptions where we assumed that we will have more imports in Europe in the future, and some or an important product is ammonia, where we assume that there will be some imports in the future. And another important assumption is, and that directly is connected with Andreas also said, is on that we had assumed a fast direct electrification. And direct electrification means that we used in the first place the most efficient electricity use, of course, to decarbonize and to defossilize and to de-natural gasize, so to achieve the exit. And this is, of course, achieved via heat pumps, and also to some extent with the less efficient electric boilers to displace fossil gas. Industrial ovens, on the other hand, which require higher temperatures, are replaced mainly after 2030. And there we also assume a lot of direct electrification, but we also assume that biomass waste and other more hydrocarbon sources that are remaining can be used there as well in the long term. And fossil gas is only a bridge in the transformation, and we mainly broke this bridge. And of course, that was one important target of the study, to show that this is possible and feasible. But we see in the midterm still the option that natural gas can help, for example, the steel industry to achieve a quicker transformation to the DRI. But we will see that in some minutes. Another important thing is, and this is directly connected to what Andreas framed as no regret hydrogen, is that we do not assume that we will have a distribution grid for hydrogen in the future. So not in general, perhaps only small local ones, but not in general, so not replacing the complete natural gas grid. So only chemical parks and steel sites will be supplied via a backbone. And no distribution grids. And that, of course, also means that the role of hydrogen as an energy carrier is limited. We use it in the scenario only in hybrid steam supply systems, so mainly chemical parks, and to some extent also in the steel industry, but mainly really to deliver a good flexibility in the electricity system as well. In 2050, then, at the end of our scenario horizon, biomethane also kicks in to some extent in the industry sector, where we replace natural gas. But we only see, in our scenario, see that in local grids. So there's no general methane grid all over Europe in place anymore. And where we have local possibilities to use biomethane, we can, of course, use it very efficiently also in the industry sector. Yeah, as a modeler, of course, you cannot do without this slide, but just a quick overview on what we did. So what kind of model did we use to derive our scenario? It's a tiered modeling approach. So we use quite a few modules to to model the industry system, but it's not an overall optimization model. That's always important. We have partial optimizations within the model, but only sector-wise and not an overall optimization approach. So the most refined value chain modeling we use in the petrochemical sector, which is probably the most complicated one in the energy-intensive industry. And there we really model polymer by polymer. We also regard waste that comes back, plastic waste that comes back, which is available as a feedstock. And then we model the petrochemical sector side by side in Europe. For other industries like iron and steel and also refineries, we did the same kind of tasks. So we also modeled them side by side in Europe, which of course offers a lot of opportunities to also regard byproducts, to regard steam that you can use as waste heat, things like that. For other sectors, especially non-metallic minerals, non-ferrous metals, and the paper industry, we used technology-specific and country-specific, but not site-specific. And then we have other industry branches which are less energy-intensive. There we used an econometric manner, using gross value added and not physical production as a driver, and assuming specific temperature level distributions for each country and each branch we model there. Yeah, coming to the results, we start with the greenhouse gas emissions, not with the gas, but with the greenhouse gas emissions. Still, that's the most important target in our scenario as well, to achieve the targets the European Union has set. And you can see for the industry and refinery sector, so that's combined, so that's not the usual aggregation you will find probably in other publications. So that's for industry and refineries together. You can see that we have a very steep decline in emissions until 2040. So it starts quite steep already until 2025, and then we have an accelerated decline afterwards as well. And we end up in 2040 with an already quite defossilized system. So energy supply is pretty defossilized then. So we phase out not only coal, but also natural gas and oil. But you can see that there are some emissions left. And in the long term, of course, process-related emissions have a greater share. And we compensate that in the scenarios by CCS and other things, like, for example, green feedstocks that use atmospheric CO2 and store it into products. But we'll come to that later on. Yeah, next slide on the aggregated level for the whole EU27 and the whole industry sector, so without refineries here. That is final energy we see here. And you can see that the total final energy, if you also include waste and ambient heat, is quite stable over time. And this is not that we just assume that it will be like that, but we have really differing developments in several branches. You will see that. So sometimes some branches increase even their energy use because they have higher growth rates, and others where others we have where efficiency increases are so great that they can also overcompensate growth. But you can see that we have an efficiency increase by 50% until 2030 in our scenario. And you can already see that electricity will have the greatest share in the long term. Biomass has also an important share. And we already also have some other remaining energy carriers in place that, but they have only a niche role. Yeah, and now coming to our main narrative of the project. This is about the gas exit. And you can see here that all over industry and refineries, when we look at 2030, which is this important milestone, we achieve a reduction of natural gas use, of fossil gas use, by 43% on average in the EU, and all countries deliver. Some more, some less, and of course here the ones here on the left side are also the greatest consumers today of natural gas. They also have in the industry sector, they of course also have the greatest shares in the reduction, but you can see country by country that relative reductions are different and of course depend on the industry structure on the one hand and on the options to electrify on the other hand. When we look how final energy use, especially for heat, looks like according to the temperature level, we get to this kind of picture where you can see that in the industry sector, of course, the highest energy inputs are in the temperature levels above 100 degrees. So that's, of course, really different from the building sector, which has also some share here in the industry. But these are mainly office buildings the industry has. Here you can see that a lot of gas is used at all temperature levels all around Europe today. And this changes, of course, a lot over time. So especially here in the temperature level above 100 degrees to 500 degrees, so that's steam supply in industry, we get a very quick reduction in natural gas use. So that's here development. And we get a lot of electrification, early electrification here. And but you can see that when we look at the longer term development, there is still a lot of other energy carriers that are relevant, especially when you look at the higher temperature levels. So biomass is really increasing. You can see here that there's a lot of biomass used today also to produce steam. There's a decline, but on the other hand, we have an increase, for high temperature heat. And we will see where this comes from. But also in the long term, we can see that secondary gases, especially in the chemical sector, have some role as well. Coming now to the specific branches. So probably the more interesting questions if you're really deep into industry. And here you can see the steel industry in the first slide of the deep dive. And on the left-hand side, you can see primary energy use in the steel industry. And on the right side, this is the crude steel production by processes in the EU 27. So not all energy use that is we have here is reflected here on the right side, or on the right-hand side, Of course, also here in the primary energy use, we also have, for example, hot rolling plants that also have an energy demand. What you can see is that we very quickly phase out the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route. So until 2035, we have phased out most of the blast furnaces in Europe in this scenario, and we have to complete phase out until 2040 already. And on the other hand, you can see that secondary steel increases its share. That's here at the top level. And the loss we have in the primary production is compensated by the introduction of shaft furnaces to produce direct reduced iron. This is the light blue section you can see here. And on the energy side, of course, we have, you can clearly see that we have a development that also mirrors that. Coke and coal, which are at the bottom level here, are phased out. So accordingly to the blast furnace phased out. And we see that electricity use, this is the one here at the top, increases. So we have a lot more also direct electrification in the steel industry as well, due to the fact that we use more electric arc furnaces and electric smelters. So more heat that is generated by electricity. And in the case of reducing agents we need, so where we have to replace coal and coke by other reducing agents in the shaft furnace, we have at the beginning a mixture of natural gas. And this is also why natural gas here in the steel industry is quite stable. On the other hand, of course, hydrogen, which increases its share over time. So in the end, we have electricity mainly for heat. We have hydrogen as a reducing agent to produce primary steel, and we have biomass as a supplementary energy carrier to, on the one hand, supply carbon in the steelmaking process, and on the other hand, to deliver a stable energy supply also for sites that are not directly connected to a hydrogen grid. And there we also have the option to make biomass CCS. We come to the chemicals. It's the second largest emitting sector, I think, of industry in Europe. And here it's more complicated. So only really a glance at this sector, you would have to do an own webinar probably on that to get really a deep understanding. So yeah, what you can see here is in principle primary energy use. It's a bit of simplified primary energy balance you can see here. So it does not reflect, for example, CHPs in Europe. But what you can see here is on the lower level is the final energy demand, which is today mainly electricity and, of course, natural gas. But what is also important in the chemical industry is the feedstock. So mainly in the petrochemical industry, we have a lot of oil input, and parts of this oil input we have here also ends up in byproducts. So especially in the steam crackers, and can be used energetically again. So the actual use to produce heat, for example, is then higher as the final energy demand here indicates in the chemical industry. So in the chemical industry, you can see that we have a quick phase out of natural gas, a quick electrification. You can also see that we foresee some share of hydrogen as a final energy carrier. But even more as a feedstock, of course. Why do we see a role for hydrogen as a final energy carrier? So it's because we see that as a very good option to deliver flexibility in the electricity system. So on the one hand, we have electric boilers that, of course, can use electricity if it's cheap. On the other hand, the chemical parks are anyway connected to hydrogen grids, and hydrogen can be used if you have not cheap electricity available, and you can have, that's also very smart, a very smooth transition from using natural gas to hydrogen as your backup energy carrier. You can see, so that was about the heat supply in the chemical industry. And here we see the feedstock on the top. I cannot really say a lot about it, but what you can already see that we have a very great transformation here as well. But that's not at the focus of the study. So I will only hint at that we also have a great transformation here as well, especially when we come to 2040. Yeah, here we look at the a bit less energy intensive industries. So some glances at these as well. Here you can see, for example, food, beverages, and tobacco. And here you can see that its energy use is growing. I think it's due to the economic activity that we foresee for this sector. So a lot of more food and beverages that are actually produced or that are processed within the European Union. And due to that, we have a higher energy demand. But if you look at the energy demand without ambient heat, and waste heat, you can see that we have a decline here as well. And of course, here you can see the example for Italy, how we see the distribution according to the temperature levels. Here you can see that we have also a lot of space heating in Italy. If the data is correct, we always have to say. But of course, you can also see, and that's not too astonishing, that heat below 100 degrees and up to 200 degrees is very important in this sector. And that's why we see a very good option, of course, here to use heat pumps. Here in the machinery and transport equipment sector, it's a bit different. You can see here in the case of Italy, of course, also that they also have this high, this steam demand. So also an option to use heat pump as well, but also a lot of just office buildings here. Maybe these are only office buildings of automotive industry, for example, that also require here the most of the energy. Of course, here as well, you have a good option to electrify with heat pumps. Coming to the pulp and paper sector, that's really a bit different now. And here we have this situation that we have a very big cluster of the pulp industry in Northern Europe, especially in Finland and Sweden, where we have the pulp industry, so where the big forests are. And at the moment, they're using a lot of biomass as final energy demand. So this comes as in the form of bark and in the form of black liquor, a byproduct of the pulp of the pulping industry. And they use it to fire boilers or CHP. In our scenario, we foresee an electrification of this sector as well, which means that you get the biomass free for other uses. And in our case, we assumed that it's not going to the fuel sector. So there are a lot of projects, I think, going on at the moment to make tall oil of these byproducts and use it in the fuel sector as a transport fuel. But we assume that these byproducts go via gasification to methanol, which would be a good platform chemical in the future for the chemical industry. So what you can see is that the already high electricity use, of course, in this sector increases as well. And with the CHP going mainly out of the system, of course, you have to supply the electricity then via external sources in these countries. But of course, they have very good potentials in these countries to do that. Coming to, I think, a really hard to abate sector now within industries. For the others, I think we have quite good solutions to get quick abatement. But here in the non-metallic minerals, not too astonishing if you're into industry. We have a development which is not as quick. So this is mainly about cement, clinker, it's about lime, it's about the glass industry and bricks. And here you can see that we also foresee a phase out of coal and coke, of course, still an important energy carrier, especially in the cement industry. But also fossil gas is actually today the most important energy carrier. And here we do not see this quick phase out as in other cases, but still we also see some quick abatement or some quick fossil gas savings that are possible. In some countries, we have still opportunities to use, for example, more waste in the cement plants. And in the long term, of course, we have still waste, but we have also increased use of biomass, especially in the cement sector, which then connected with the CCS, which is, of course, mainly needed for the process-related emissions. So together with CCS, we then get negative emissions of the non-metallic minerals sector if we get to BECCS there. Yeah, electrification is also important in this sector. You can see that we have an increase here, but often we have applications where a direct electrification is not feasible 100%. So for the glass industry, for example, today we have not a technology yet for a complete electrification for all kind of glass qualities. And also in the cement industry, we do not have the technology yet, but we can do part electrifications, for example, in the calcination sector. There's some electrification has also some role here. So leaving now the industries, the classical industry sector, and coming to the refineries, which are usually in the presentations part of the conversion sector, so the energy conversion sectors. So, but don't, we should not get messed up here. But what do we see for the refinery sector? So we also had a look at this sector in Europe. And here we can see that we have a quite quick closing of refineries. You can see it here only at the aggregated level from an input of circa 550 million tons of crude oil per year to roughly 350 by 2030, so very quick. This is of course due mainly to a reduction in demand. In this scenario we have here, which we got from Transport and Environment. We don't have such a quick demand reduction here, but in other scenarios there's even more. But nevertheless, we see that we have also some overcapacities in Europe, especially in Southern Europe, which can be molten down to some extent already very quickly. But after that, we have then net imports of fuels, green fuels mainly. So we see a role here, of course, for Chile, for the MENA region, and other very privileged regions to deliver green hydrocarbon fuels to Europe. So in Europe, in our scenario, we still see some role for that. So to increase supply security, we assumed that we will have green refineries in Europe, but the bulk of the hydrocarbon green fuels will come from abroad. You can see that we concentrated the refineries here, the green refineries in 2050 at sweet spots. So the Iberian Peninsula in principle, the North Sea, and also the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. So places where we have good opportunities to produce cheap green hydrogen from electrolysis, which is of course required to produce this Fischer-Tropsch syncrude you can see here. These are very, very specific locations where we see this role. Finally, we have a slide on CCS in industry, and partly we have covered that already when we talked about energy. So not very astonishing probably for you that we start with rather small volumes in 2030 in the cement industry especially, but with a quite quick ramp up until 2045, where we cover really the bulk of the cement plants in Europe with CCS. You can see that other sectors have CCS as well, but CCS is for us only for plants where we see that it's really a really good option, and the target is really to try to minimize it. But on the other hand, we have the option to use biomass and to do BECCS, which of course is an option to create carbon sinks and to deliver net negative emissions. And where we do that is the steel industry. Here, of course, we do not only have a few process-related emissions. So here the motivation is really to do BECCS, and it's a great part we have here. So over 20 million tons per year we capture and store in the steel industry. The other sectors are also part of the minerals industry, lime, and also to some extent glass industry. There it's of course more difficult because it's more scattered around Europe. We see a role for CCS, and the remaining ones we haven't touched upon is aluminium, where we also have the carbon in the anodes. So the CO2 coming from that, which is here captured, and we have the chemicals as well, where we have still steam cracker operations. So even these are operated with green feedstock. So if you count that completely, it's also a net negative emission there. So it's green feedstock that is used. The byproducts are burned in the cracker and are then captured and stored. So what does all these things mean in regard to investments? So this picture here does not cover all things. So we have also talked about CCS. We all have also talked about the steel transformation. Here we only talk about heat. And what you can see is that we have a peak in the years starting in 2026 under 2030. And this is not to, of course, this is due to the fact that we want to have this quick exit and this quick reduction in gas use. And that's why we see that really great investments in the industry. Still, it's not too big if we compare it to the building sector. There we have a lot of more investments. But of course, in the industry sector, it's really concentrated often to a couple of players. So if we talk about the chemical industry, for example, this is the case, or the iron and steel industry. But of course, we also have other sectors which have a lot of investments here they need. For example, the food industry, you can see here, has really high investment needs due to their the heat pumps they have to install. And also other industries have really high investments related to the money they have to pay. On the other hand, if we look at the gigawatt hours that are installed, we can see that here in 2030, this seems really quite a lot, but we also have to take into account that this is fuel related here. So it's not the energy delivered, but it's in regards to the fuel use. So a heat pump would be here rather small, but here in regarding to euros rather high. And here in regards to the fuel use and the investments that have to be taken, the chemical industry clearly dominates this picture in this period where we have here a lot of electrode boiler investments and hydrogen boiler investments. So this is due to this story I told you about hybrid steam supply systems. Yeah, I think that was my presentation. I think I was quite in time. So I can still say many thanks to you, listeners and watchers of the presentation today. Thanks for Andreas and the Agora team for giving us this project and for doing it together with us over the period of, I think, 2 years almost. So many thanks for that, and looking forward to your questions and to your discussions. And to the discussions, we will have my colleague Georg Holz will also be available to answer your questions, and looking forward to this.
I was muted there for a second. Hello, thank you, Clemens, very much for this wonderful presentation. And Georg, maybe you can join us now here for this Q&A section. I can encourage all of the viewers to now pose your questions in the Q&A function here in Zoom. So if you type in your questions there, we will take them as we see they are appropriate, maybe cluster them if we see similar questions coming in, and hope to answer all of your questions. And if we can't get to it, we will follow up by email as best we can, but we actually have a decent amount of time still left. So please pose your questions and use this opportunity for Clemens and Georg to address them. And the very first question that came in, it regards your CCS slide. And so maybe you want to actually pull that up again, Clemens. It might help, and Georg, in your answer. So the question relates to CCS for chemicals, and the observation of the viewer was that you had very little CCS indicated for use in chemicals, and the question was, does that imply that you do not see a significant conversion of hydrogen production for fertilizers, among other things, and the switch from gray to blue hydrogen in those applications? So over to Georg in this case, I believe, or no, Clemens. Thank you.
Yeah, I can take it. It's also due to the system boundaries we have. So hydrogen production itself was part of the energy sector, so it was modeled by Artelis. What I recall is that we actually did not see a big role for blue hydrogen, and so it's only limited. It's about the projects already in the pipeline that were assumed to be in the system. So that's included, but we did not show it. But indeed, we see mainly green hydrogen in the long term. So especially in 2040, I think blue hydrogen does not play a role anymore.
Sorry, Andreas, I think you're on mute.
Oh, my apologies. So the second question also relates to CCU, in this case, CCUS. And the question is, why was CCUS not considered for refining?
Yeah, so the main thing is that we do not see a role for fossil feedstock refineries in the end. So if you foresee a role for that, so if you assume that crude oil refineries still deliver feedstock for the chemical industry, and if you want to do that, addressing all the carbon you have in the system, then you of course have a role for CCS there as well. But we see the refining sector here as a quite slowly phasing out sector, so the crude oil refining sector. And this is also why we do not see there a big role for CCS, I think. So that's the main reason. But we have, so if you look at it, a bit more downstream, so in the steam crackers, for example, we see a role for CCS, but it's limited.
Thank you, Clemens. So the third question that we've received relates to the geographic picture for industry. You had mentioned at the very beginning that we foresaw or allowed for some relocation in industry. So maybe you can share a little bit about what share you assume or how these things develop in the results. But also the second part of this question is, why do you expect the renewables push from countries with lower LCOE to only lead to little allocation?
Yeah, so where we have a lot of implicit relocation is the fuel sector, right? So there we really see that Europe might be, so of course today we also import crude oil, so mainly, so the domestic production, of course, of crude oil is also not too big, but also in the future we will have only a few refinings left, and so also the value chain step of producing fuels will be mainly outside Europe in our scenario. So there we have this kind of renewables pool. On the other hand, we have, because we do not really wanted to show a deindustrialized Europe in the end, so we have a lot of relocation within the EU. That I can say. And especially in the steel sector, we see that option. And in the scenario, we foresee that, for example, on continental Europe steel sites, they will, of course, produce steel in the long term as well, because a market near production makes always sense, I think. And in the production chain step of steel production, also so the energy price differentiation does not make too much difference. So that I think makes sense. But within Europe, these sites will partly import DRI, be it from Sweden or from the Iberian Peninsula, be it from outside Europe. So we have a relocation of very energy intensive steps we foresee in the scenario. But of course, it could be more in the end. So Europe could also import more DRI than we foresee in the scenario. So in our scenario, it's for 2050, we have quite a net balanced system where the whole production of iron ore, for example, in Sweden, is converted to DRI. So so that's actually the goal they have. And in the scenario, we also foresee that they will do it. And so we will also have these investments in DRI within Europe. But of course, if it will end up also in European steel plants, it's another question. But that's the picture on the steel industry we have. So there will be a lot of relocation when it comes to the reducing step. But we did not foresee that it could come all from Brazil or Australia. But of course, there are discussions going on into this direction. If you have followed the webinar last week on the global steel transformation that Andreas already mentioned, you see that we have this discussion, of course, that the iron ore producing countries could, in the end, have a lot of more of a share of this cake of DRI in the end. But that's still open, and of course that's also due to industrial policy things, supply security questions we have. So we believe that it will not be only an economic question in the end, how big the share will be, but also a question of industrial policy. And that's why we see in our scenario that we have also a lot of domestic production in Europe still in 2050, even if we have, of course, if there are of course other regions in the world that have better conditions, no question.
Thank you, Clemens, for this expansive answer. But could you just maybe highlight a little bit the supply chain consequences of this kind of process of importing more iron ore? Some people speak of it as embodied hydrogen. Maybe just flesh out what would that mean for the type of hydrogen demand we would have here if we import the iron ore or if we do not.
Very good. So the assumption or the idea of embodied hydrogen means that we have the very hydrogen intensive step of reducing the iron ore to DRI outside Europe. And with this, we do not import iron ore as we do today anyway. So most of the iron ore we use in Europe comes from outside the European Union. We do not import this iron ore, but we import the DRI with its rucksack, so to say, of hydrogen that was needed to produce it. And of course, with this, we can decrease a lot our future hydrogen demand. But still, we think that would not be 100% thing. So we see that the steel industry in Europe will probably have some production of DRI as well to increase their security in these global markets.
Thank you. And sticking with the steel industry, we have two questions on iron and steel from one participant. So the first one is, what is the lifespan of the current and projected blast furnace facilities? And does the rapid takeover of electric arc furnaces and electric arc furnaces coupled with DRI take into account the availability of scrap in Europe? And I think you've answered the question on iron ore to some extent, at least.
Yeah, so the lifespan of the current blast furnaces, we were very conservative about that, or perhaps optimistic, you could say, from a climate protection perspective. So Agora Industry made a lot of work on that. They analyzed the actual lifespans between relinings of blast furnaces. And often we have shorter times than. So in the literature, you find 20 to 25 years as a usual lifespan of a relined blast furnace. But in reality, we see much shorter times. And that's also why we achieved this very, very quick phase out of blast furnaces. You've seen that we almost achieved the phase out completely until 2035. So that is, of course, due to this empirical finding. We see that it's much shorter, the lifespan of such a blast furnace, than we see it in literature. Yeah, in regard to scrap, I think it's difficult. I think there will be enough scrap available. So we have already today, we export a lot of scrap to Turkey, for example. But it's more a question about the qualities, of course. So I think we can clearly say that that there will scrap be available, and it also will increase over time. I think most of the models I know show that. But the question is, can we really phase it in our steel production system, which often requires high qualities? So if we have really a lot of impurities in the scrap, and the automotive industry is here the clear problem. With the scrap we get back from the shredders is highly polluted with copper, and that's the main issue. So on the one hand, we have to improve that, so get more clean scrap, by better sorting. And on the other hand, we have to have a really clear monitoring also of scrap export and import flows to enable Europe to better to increase the role of scrap in the system, and to get to a lower dependency on iron ore imports on the other hand as well. So I think that's a main task in the steel industry. And the monitoring of scrap also means that we take into account that we not really cannibalize DRI production. So if we attract in Europe all clean scrap in the world, that does not help the system and the climate. It only makes our steel industry quite emission. Low emission, of course, that would be feasible in the short term if we do that, but that does not really help the system. So that's why we are cautious when we assume a higher share of ERF and scrap in the future.
Thank you. And we have a couple of follow-up questions. So I'll start with the first. I think it's not looking necessarily at our results, but maybe from your own perspective, which are the industries mentioned for which the difference between the ambitious decarbonization targets in the modeling? So where are the differences biggest between the pathway and the industry's own targets for decarbonization? I mean, it's not your role to necessarily speak for the steel and other sectors, but do you have any observations of where our pathway diverges from, let's say, the publicly discussed pathways of specific sectors?
I think the steel industry, for example, I'm quite aware of the discussion there, and they are quite following in principle this narrative, at least. I think the pace is still very ambitious we have in the scenario also for them, but we cannot actually see there any projects now on relining blast furnaces at the moment, so not too far as I know. But a lot of projects, on the other hand, to build up DRI plants, which might be challenging because of engineering capacities and things like that. So I think for the steel industry, I would say it's we can see that the industry itself also follows this kind of pathway as well. For the chemical industry, I'm not so sure. There's a lot of, so it's very ambitious what we see there as for an electrification. And there I cannot really see that they are so ambitious at the moment. Of course, they have a lot of fear now in regards to the US. They are clearly trying to identify should they relocate their production to other parts in the world, things like that. So a lot of discussions going on in this direction, and unfortunately less in regard to what can we quickly do to get to better conditions. So of course, electricity price discussion is an important thing, and that would also, I think, help to get to such a kind of development and a quick electrification, which we see in the scenario. But I think we are still a bit away from that. And maybe Georg, can you say something about the minerals industry? I think that would be very good.
Yes, of course. Maybe for cement particularly, must admit I'm not aware, or I don't have in my head the targets of glass and lime industries on a European scale. But for cement industry, I think we are not very far away, or the differences are not very big compared from our scenario to what actually the ambitions and the pathways that associations on a European scale and also on national scales have already put out. So I think this is quite in line. I still think it's quite ambitious, of course, to get it really on the road, so to say, and to put it into place. Maybe there's comparing the role of biomass, we are a bit more bold in saying that use of biomass in cement industry makes a lot of sense, because we get the combined effects of having high temperature heat and negative emissions in one place and needing only the infrastructure in one place. But besides that, I think it's actually very similar as far as I know out of my head.
I do assume that one sector where these things might not be aligned is the refinery sector. But maybe Clemens, do you want to comment on that at all? I mean, do you how did we take into account, let's say, the developments in the market, at least again when looking at the refinery sector? So are we reflecting a transformation that is already being played out in the refinery sector? Or is it far removed from what we are seeing in that sector?
No, I think at the moment we are really far away. So we had, for example, we have discussions on really securing all kind of refineries. So that's a very defensive thing at the moment. So all countries that have refineries, and especially in particular these that are still dependent on Russian oil, they are rather defending them. We also had a discussion in Germany for Schwed refinery, so we do not really see here a phase out, but rather, we have a discussion on secure them in the short term at least, and then I think on the level of individual refineries, there are of course projects going on to make them green. But I do not see, from a state view, I do not see already the ambition to really look at the system and also to discuss the necessary capacity alignments we need. I think that's a discussion which is really needed, but I do not see that going on already. Of course, individual refineries, they have partly also ambitious projects they follow. But we still have a lot of refineries that do not have clear targets, or very, you cannot really tell what they are heading at. And especially on the system level, I think the discussion is missing at the moment that we need these refinery closures or massive capacity downscaling. Of course, that's also feasible in the midterm.
Yes, and thank you, Clemens. And I would just reiterate that while this is clearly an outcome and an observation from the modeling, unfortunately, we had to place an emphasis in the study in one place or another. And so while we did actually do quite a detailed modeling on the refinery sector, the actual pathway discussion and the transformation discussion was not at the focus of the study. But I think it is, to some extent, a conclusion and a result of the study how important this, as you say, transformation discussion is. So hopefully we'll be able to pick that up in the next year or two. So yes.
If I may, because the back of my head has just worked while you were talking about the lime and glass, so I now have some thoughts about the lime and glass industries as well. I think I think it's worth to spell out some of the differences maybe that we have here, because as far as I get the discussions in those sectors, it's largely about electrification and hydrogen for energy provision, but instead we think that particularly in those sectors, biomethane or local methane could play an important role as an energy carrier, because it fits perfectly into the system. Basically, don't have to change anything at the plants themselves, and we have some resources we assume of biogas or biomethane that can be used, which is no longer used in the power sectors. So this could make a nice match for those hard to abate sectors. So this is one thing, and the other thing maybe is about CCS and infrastructure, where we assume a certain level of CCS infrastructure to be available at those plants, but comparably probably low levels. So if I have it correctly in my mind, we assume about maybe 50% of the lime plants being connected to CCS infrastructure only, so to say, because they are comparably small sources. So in particular, the smaller lime plants have emission levels which economically do not make so much sense to build large infrastructures and to build up CCS plants there. So we assume that this can be that there will be some remaining emissions in those sectors, those plants, but they will be compensated by negative emissions in other sectors.
In this context, at the beginning, Clemens, you explained that actually the location-specific modeling was only for specific sectors, and that actually the sectors that Georgi have just mentioned were not among those where we could do that location-specific modeling. What we also haven't been able to do in this study is to do a detailed infrastructure modeling, for example, for a CCS infrastructure. If you were now to go in the next step to do such, what would you see as some of the challenges in developing, especially for non-metallic minerals, kind of an infrastructure to actually support this pathway?
Well, if you talk about challenges, I think one of the challenges is that as I just said, we have smaller plants that are scattered around the landscape. We don't have the site-specific modeling here, but we know roughly that they are, in particular, lime and cement industries are located where the lime is, and so it's typically not close to industrial centers and so on. So we have that kind of information, and so we will not be able to connect each and every plant, in my view. And then, of course, a challenge is to make a decision, so to say. We would need some kind of a process or anything to decide somehow who will be who will get access to infrastructure and who not. So it needs some kind of procedural approach for that one. And the other challenge I would see, in particular for cement industry, we are kind of all agree, as far as I know, in this sector that there will be less demand for cement clinker in the future. So we will have a declining demand for cement clinker. So we will have, and then we will probably see a further concentration of the production of cement clinker in some plants. So we will not have each and every plant that is producing today will be producing clinker in 2050, and we don't know which ones will be and which ones won't be in 2050. So that makes a certain challenge for the planning of such an infrastructure.
Do you see that for lime as well? So for lime, we also have a decline in production to some extent. We still need it for steel, but not for the power plants probably anymore.
Yeah, probably will be the same.
So just maybe a follow-up question to what you've just said. So this is something that under current conditions, the market would solve, let's say, as you say, making it difficult for that infrastructure planning. So is this something that needs to be tackled, let's say, at a political level to be able to make this infrastructure planning possible, or is it likely just to remain messy?
Probably both. So I think it. I mean, there are discussions whether there should be a fair access, so to say, to CO2 infrastructure for everyone. That means that you probably would have to provide, from a planning perspective, access to everyone. But then you have, of course, on the system level, you have your macroeconomic costs and so on, and your infrastructure costs, which probably doesn't make sense to connect each and every one, and you have like these multiple forces working. So I think, in my view, it is something to be tackled and something that is of interest for planning. And but on the other hand, in reality, will probably be a bit messy, because now first infrastructure planners and potential operators start to develop first grid plans and so on. So it will be probably both a bit.
Thank you. And I have one more question at the moment, and we have a couple more minutes. We can maybe take one more question after this one, but let me pose it to you, Clemens. So when looking at refineries, I understand this question as saying, if we start phasing out fossil refineries, then some byproducts will disappear that are currently needed. How do we cope with that in the future? They make specific reference to bitumen coke. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see this transformation happening, and whether those new biorefineries and other technologies are going to be able to cover this byproduct demand, or is that something we can say with the modeling we've done?
Yeah, that's not really a modeling question, I would say, but we are really talking about byproducts now. These are really, they deliver a really low income for the refineries at the moment, and we have to be really aware of that. Of course, so if we have a fossil fuel phase out and a fossil refinery phase out, we will, with the technology today, for example, not be able to, as far as I know, to produce bitumen. And also, for example, we have a problem with anodes, carbon anodes for the steel industry and for the aluminum industry, where you use very, very specific cokes, petrol coke sorts to get to this, to these. But of course, the question is: do we, in a world where there are still refineries there, I think we would not really have to matter so much about it. You could also have a bitumen refinery on its own, for example. That would also be possible. So I think that's not the first question to tackle. But of course, in the long term, and the world really going to defossilization and also phasing out crude oil, then we will have really an issue around this, which has to be solved somehow. But of course, in regard to bitumen, for example, we also can recycle probably more than we probably do today.
And if I may add, I mean, in some cases we may also be able to replace. I mean, bitumen, if it's used for streets, I think those can also be built using cement instead, which would then, of course, increase to a certain degree the amount of cement needed. But I mean, there are replacements possible, and I think for coke, at least in the modeling, I think in some cases we optimistically assume that some of this coke or the coke can be derived from biogenic sources.
Yeah, when we think about carbon, it's about that we still have in the system. It's about carbon to be added in electric arc furnaces and electric smelters, where we think biogenic carbon source is not really a problem. So that's really about, as far as we know, about optimizing the system and optimizing the carbon use so that you can also make it that you can also use biogenic sources. So for sure there will be some research and development, but that's not a major roadblocker we see there. But for example, when it comes to carbon anodes, the example I mentioned, I'm not aware of any technology or feedstock at the moment that could deliver that. So a carbon anode to produce aluminium, but on the other hand, we have also research going on other anode types that do without carbon and then also do not have carbon emissions, CO2 emissions. So we would not need CCS then for the aluminum industry. So that's not all fixed. So some challenges are harder than others, I would say, but it's really about small amounts, I would say, that are really, really critical.
Since I don't see any additional questions, I'll allow myself a last follow-up question here. So looking at also the other sectors that are transforming, I mean, off the top of your mind, are there other byproducts that actually disappear in the processes and the transformation that we foresee that are also things that will ultimately need to be part of the discussion, but aren't perhaps the first thing to be looking at?
So you mean other byproducts that are okay.
Of other industrial processes?
Yeah. So yeah, for sure there are small amounts that we do not even see. Yeah. So people that are into then life cycle analysis questions and things like that, they might see other issues. Of course, we have an own discussion on raw materials and Energiewende on the one hand, but also about, of course, there might also be byproducts that we lose somehow and that we might need. But I cannot really, probably we are really talking about low things, but they might still be critical, for sure. Also small amounts can be critical. So the things we oversee in our modelings are rather the bulk things. And on this level, we do, of course, see that we have issues in the steel industry and in the chemical industry if we have a transformation there. So you lose some of our byproducts. On the other hand, you have a better conversion to products. So you can substitute the byproduct use by electricity if it's cheap enough. Or on the other hand, you can still be flexible, import your hydrocarbon, be a bit less efficient in transforming it into your products and still use hydrocarbon byproducts, for example, to produce steam at your site. So you still might be flexible in the end, and it also might depend how your electricity price really is compared to the price you have to pay for your green feedstock that you can probably import. So that's what we oversee in our modeling, that really more the big streams, but probably not the most critical ones.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I think this helps us kind of wrap up this conversation in saying, I mean, I think we, with this study, have really painted a quite detailed picture of how this transformation away from fossil gas in Europe could take place. I think we discussed today, to some extent, that in some cases in the industry, for example, it is aligned with what the industry is at least aiming to do. Whether they are implementing at that speed is another question. Whether infrastructure will be available, one topic we had today, is another question. So all those things would have to be solved. On the other hand, we show that it is feasible if, let's say, the technologies are deployed at scale and at speed, if the coordination that is required for infrastructure takes place. And yet, even then, new questions are raised by doing this type of analysis, whether it's how to, guide the refinery sector through a period of immense transformation, or even the nitty-gritty of byproducts and how to replace them, things that aren't the first priority and the first thing to address, but ultimately in this transformation will have to be addressed. So with that, I think it was a very interesting conversation. Clemens and Georg, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and helping us, for now, conclude our work on this pathway study with regards to industry. Thank you so much for your cooperation over the last 2 years, in fact, as you say. It's been a long process, and we went from it really being very much technical feasibility study to something that went also into geopolitics, let's say, and the kind of broader goal of also reducing dependence of the EU on fossil gas imports to a greater extent.